Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Career Roundtable. My name is Jill Averill. I am the Project Manager of Scientific Programming at Keystone Symposia. For our Career Roundtable today, the way our format will work is that we will be doing a half-hour discussion between myself and the panelists. At the 30-minute mark, I will invite everyone to turn on their cameras and join us. During the first 30 minutes, you can submit any questions you have in the chat box, which is in the Zoom screen at the bottom. I will be monitoring the chat box. I will call on you to turn your mic on and ask your question live, and that will be for the second half hour. So at this time, I would like to invite our panelists to go ahead and turn on their cameras and mics and join us to start our discussion. We're being joined today with Judith Friedman from Stanford, Kylie Walters from the NIH, and Ingrid Wertz from Bristol Myers Squibb.
Everyone.
All right, so welcome you all. Thank you so much for joining us and being on this panel. So to start us off, I think we could just kind of briefly talk about your career trajectory, kind of how you wound up where you are, what sort of happened along the way. So Ingrid, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you. So it's a real pleasure to be on this panel with Kylie and Judith, and so thank you for the invitation. I definitely have, I think, probably an atypical career path, really just characterized by a lot of flexibility and wanting to, just follow my real desires and appreciating how those really changed along the way as I got to know more about the different possibilities in the world of science and medicine. So I was a MD PhD student, and in the middle of my PhD training, I had the opportunity to, via NIH biotechnology training grant, to do a internship at a company that was sponsoring this grant, and actually chose to work at Genentech, and was really fortunate that Vishva Dixit opened up his lab and allowed me to do an internship. The thing that I did not know is that I would, within about 5 minutes of walking in the door, realize that I really wanted to finish my PhD studies there. And so it was, again, I was very fortunate that Vishva agreed to that. And so I did this sort of combined institution, finishing up my studies in Vishva's lab. And it also happened that I met my husband there in Vishva's lab. So at the end of my training and my husband's training, we had sort of the two-body issue. I wouldn't say it was a problem, because we solved that very nicely by me then transferring to WashU in St. Louis and finishing up my medical studies there. When I finished my MD PhD training, again, had the opportunity to investigate both academia, and I interviewed for internal medicine residency programs, and also that were combined with research fellowships at UCSF and Stanford, and also interviewed at about 4 different either larger or smaller companies and focused on scientist positions there, and ultimately chose to come back to Genentech. And it was a fantastic 15 years there as a scientist, and really recently decided to make the move to Bristol Myers Squibb. So have been there for just a few weeks, actually maybe about starting my 6th week now. So happy to answer any questions about transitions and flexibility and all of that.
Great, thank you. Kylie, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah. So I got my PhD in Gerhard Wagner's lab at Harvard University, and then went to Harvard Medical School, which was really kind of staying on in the same place, in Peter Halley's lab for a postdoc. And within the first year of that postdoc, so my husband and I were both, so I had the similar thing. I met my husband in graduate school, and we were both in NMR spectroscopy. And at that time, NMR was a little bit like how cryo-EM is now, where, people were hiring in that area. And the University of Minnesota had been through like 2 hiring searches, and both of them ended up without hiring somebody. So they were in a pretty dire situation of wanting to have somebody come in and use the instruments. And so we kind of through Gerhard Wagner, his postdoctoral advisor, my PhD advisor, learned of the position and applied for it as a 2-faculty situation. And we were lucky enough to get those positions. So it was kind of similar to what Ingrid said, that, the 2-body problem kind of worked out okay for us. And then, we were there for like 10 years, 11 years. And then during that time, we're pretty happy there in academia, but then had opportunities to move to the NIH. And then 7 years ago, kind of moved to here. And so now currently I moved my group here, and I currently have an independent research here at the NCI.
Great, thank you. Judith, can you share a little bit about your career trajectory?
Sure. So I am originally from Argentina. I did my university studies there. I studied chemistry, and then I did a PhD in biochemistry, also at the University of Buenos Aires. And then my then boyfriend, now husband, came to the US to do a postdoc. So I came just for 2 years to the US while he was finishing up his postdoc, and I did my postdoc in New York with Ulrich Hartl at Sloan Kettering. I really loved it. It was a really positive experience. And at some point we got married and decided we were not going back to Argentina. The political situation there had deteriorated a lot, and there was really no possibilities then of doing science for both of us. So he got a faculty position in UCSF, and I stayed in New York. So we were separated for a couple of years, having a long distance relationship. And then when I decided to stay here and go look for a faculty position, we both looked again. He was already by then an assistant professor, for faculty positions in both New York and in San Francisco. And then I got a faculty position at Stanford, and he stayed in UCSF, and so I've been in Stanford since then. So that's kind of my career path. Yeah.
Great, thank you. It sounds like a lot of things kind of had to come together for that to work out.
Yeah.
That's great. All right. So we talk a lot about the differences between choosing a career in industry versus choosing a career in academia. Now we also have someone from government who can also talk about kind of this third path. So kind of on that track, how did you know which was the right path for you? And what are some of the pros and cons of being in the field that you chose to be in? So Ingrid, let's circle back to you.
Okay, thank you. So yes, so I guess to the first question about choosing institution, because as I mentioned, I did interview for both academic institutions and also either larger companies or startups, and I think what I knew at the time and what I still feel is that really, I think it's, through my medical training, really, I think if I do one thing in my career, it's to is to help patients, right? I think that's just the single most important thing that I want to do. And I am absolutely, inspired by the academic setting and being able to do startups. And I think that is phenomenal. And that's one, career option. And then I think the other career option is just to be, in the center of it, and where the compounds and the drugs are made, and in that sort of translational setting. And I would have to say that, I ultimately chose the biotech, biopharma industry, just because because of that internship that I had done at Genentech when I was a graduate student. And I really just saw how that the very basic science ideas could really be translated to therapeutics that really, really help patients, by the millions. And so I think that was just a really strong influence on me that led me to choose the biopharma industry. And of course, unfortunately, there'll never be a control experiment to know whether having gone the academic route and doing a startup, focused on therapeutics would have been a better option. But we go with our best choice and just sort of go all in. So yeah, I mean, that was the decision-making process. And I feel that, wanting to do the basic science and translate that, has so far worked out well. Was there another part to the question? I feel like it was multiple parts.
Do you have any insights to share on some of the pros and cons of being in industry?
Yes. So we'll start with the pros. I think that, and again, because I don't really have a control situation, I think that at least for me, right, I can just speak for me. It was just good to be in a situation where I was constantly reminded of, the impact that we can have on patients. And really, I personally tend to be the type of researcher who wants to discover, or at least explore everything. And I think that really helped to focus my research, is to really focus it on patients, because I'm admittedly easily distracted. So I think that was a good choice for me. So I think that's a pro. I would say a con is that I would say that I would love to be involved in more collaborations with colleagues. And I see that happening more in academia, and we can do it to a certain extent in the biopharma industry. But I think those collaborations are, a bit more complicated for various reasons. And so I see less of them. I think there might be, some more roadblocks that I, as a scientist, probably have less expertise to comment on. I'm just noticing that there seems to be a lot more collaborations amongst, colleagues in academia. And I honestly just wish there was some way to expand those. That's what I really wish, because to me, that's really the fun part of science, is solving problems together and using, really unique features of what's available in biopharma and in academia to get the job done.
Great, thank you. Kylie, can you talk a little bit about how you found your role in a government institute and how you knew it was right for you?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I have the best of both worlds here, because so I was really interested in taking the basic science that I was doing and applying it to cancer research. And I feel like here, because, I'm at the National Cancer Institute, and there's a strong clinical program. And I feel like kind of because of that, like I have a lot of colleagues, in my institution who are part of that, who are seeing patients. And I kind of feel like so I am a basic researcher. I'm not like Ingrid. I don't have a medical degree. I have a PhD. But what's really great is collaborating with my NCI colleagues here, I feel like I can be a part of directing my research a little more closely to what my colleagues here say is needed in the clinic. And so I feel like I get an exposure to that, but yet I still get to have all the academic freedom that you have at a university, meaning I can like kind of take and I don't know about what it's like in industry really by personal experience. So I could be wrong, but I feel like in general, like maybe you have a little less, and maybe Ingrid, I'm wrong about this. So I don't know, but I feel like at least I can speak about what I have, which is full freedom to work on whatever I want. And, I feel like the environment is very well supported in terms of equipment and infrastructure. So like when I was at the University of Minnesota, I encountered problems that, just paying for NMR time, we needed huge amounts of it. And it was stifling to finishing some of the more impactful projects we were doing because it just required so much time. And here you don't have that, like there's a lot of infrastructure and equipment that you really just have nominal fees to be able to use. And so I feel like through the infrastructure here, you can really expand your research in directions that, even though it might be available, it's, in those academic settings, oftentimes it's not affordable unless you're at very select institutions that somehow do a really good job with that.
All right.
I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah. I'm going to circle back to Ingrid here for a minute. Judith, I haven't forgotten about you, but so, to Kylie's point, Ingrid, do you feel like in industry, maybe you have less scientific freedom in what you're doing and where your research is directed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that I can only speak for myself personally, is I tend to be interested in a lot of different things. So I have not really experienced that, inability to research things that I want to, because I feel like there's so many different paths that one can go down in order to be able to develop therapeutics to help patients. So I would say that, usually what the case is that it's actually helpful to have that focus, where I will present, ideas to, some sort of a committee and say that I'm interested in, these 5 things, and these are the data to suggest that we should do that. And then what comes back is say, okay, focus on these 2, which is actually really helpful, so it's not that really things get taken away. It's just that things get focused, right? Which to me is a helpful thing.
Great, thank you. And it looks like Judith had a question for you too.
Yes.
About what limits collaborations in industry?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I would say that, and I was starting to type an answer, so maybe I'll start reading that. Is there's sort of spectacular examples of where academic institutions and industry can pair together in order to develop really blockbuster drugs. I would say one that I was involved in was venetoclax, the BCL2 family inhibitor. And, that was in collaboration with the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute and AbbVie and Genentech. And that was just a pure delight to be in, because every institution, brought together really their own sets of strengths to really synergize. And I would just say that it's really more of an observation, that there just seems to be collaborations between academic institutions just seem a bit more facile, and maybe it's something that is not really true. It's more of an observation, and really what limits those, I don't know. Again, maybe it's just the complexities with putting together contracts and agreements, and who gets what IP and that kind of, situation, which is challenging and maybe makes people, think twice before collaborating with biopharma. But I think, that may not necessarily be the case. And there's obviously, great examples of where that hasn't been the case, and collaborations have existed. So I think it's, maybe just something to watch out for in the future. And I think if all parties are willing to make it, really want to have it happen, then it probably really will happen.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, Judith, you have spent a lot of your career kind of in the academic field. How did you know that that path was right for you?
Well, I didn't quite know it at the beginning. I just seemed the way to continue doing what I want to do and like to do, which is research basic fundamental questions in biology. That's what I was interested in. And academia has been really wonderful in that way because it allows you complete intellectual autonomy. Nobody will tell you what you need to work on, particularly if you're not, let's say, if you would be in an Alzheimer's Institute, maybe you have some sort of expectation to work on Alzheimer's, but if you're in a university, you can work on anything you want. You can wake up one day and say, I wonder how proteins fold in archaea. And if you can raise the money to do that, to support that research, then you can do it. Nobody can tell you, don't work on this. So this is really amazing. The complete freedom and intellectual autonomy to pursue your passions or your interests without anybody telling you what to do is, I don't think there is another job in the universe that you can do that. So that's really, I really enjoy that very much. I also enjoy very much training people. I think it's very exciting to have somebody come in and they be interested in answering a particular question or in addressing a certain problem, and then helping them learn how to do it, guide them through the process of designing experiments, writing a paper, writing a fellowship, becoming themselves autonomous, and then have them leave and go on and do that on their own independent career. That is really very satisfying. And actually it is a little bit like what one sees when you have children and they grow up and they become independent adults. It's very, very satisfying to be a mediator in that process. So these are the positives, and it's really very exciting. It's very, very refreshing intellectually to have the option to completely change the problem you work on. I mean, not that I still work on the same problems I used to work on when I was a postdoc in Ulrich's lab, but that's my own choice. It's not that I have to do it. If I would stop being interested in, say, the chaperoning trick or co-translational folding, I could stop working on that and never look back and work on something new. So I think that is really a huge positive, and it keeps your ideas fresh and your approaches fresh, because after a while you think the same way about a problem, and so thinking about a different problem is a way to renew how you think about things, and it's kind of like very, very fun and refreshing. There are two major problems in academia. One is maybe a part of human nature, which is academic institutions, like every other institution, has a lot of bureaucracy and politics, but I think this is inherent to any human activity. So I guess it comes with the territory. I think the major problem in academia nowadays, particularly in the US, is a really terrible lack of funding for science, particularly for basic science. And actually, I have to teach, and which is an activity I enjoy. I don't love it, but I think it's also a good way to keep your mind active. And I always wanted to teach a class about where all the useful things in medicine come from. And I think the top 10, including X-rays, MRIs, and I would say almost, drugs, don't come from targeted medical approaches. They come from somebody that played with cathode tubes, or somebody that wanted to see if you can measure the spin of protons, or somebody doing dyes to color wools in 19th century Germany. I mean, I think the basic science has a tremendous value, both practical but also fundamental. And this is the major problem. I think me and I think all professors spend, I would say, 50% of their time looking for funding, which is an incredible waste of resources, because it's become really like completely futile. You submit 10 grants to get one. And this is really, particularly when you consider in the recent pandemic, in which we all live, the only thing that really solved any problem was science. Everything else failed to cut the mustard. It's really incredibly ironic that funding for science has become so terrible. But anyway, what can you do? It is the way it is. So overall, I think it's still a good profession.
Great, thank you. So we're going to ask 2 more questions, and then we're going to start doing audience questions. So everyone, please start submitting your questions in the chat box, and we will switch over in just a few moments. So kind of, Judith talked a little bit about one of the challenges in academia being getting funding. So kind of building off of that, what is a challenge that you have faced in your career, and how did you overcome it? What worked? What didn't work? And I will just wait for someone to tell me they want to go first this time.
So how I overcame
how you overcame a challenge in your career.
The major challenge in my career has been getting funding. I just brute force.
Mm-hmm. And grant writing is a big portion of getting funding in the academic field.
Yeah.
Well, I can add to that so that's one nice thing about being in the government at the NIH, is that our funding structure is a little bit different. So in the great times, you can't expand the way you can in academia. You can't ever have a lab of like 40 people really. But in the harder times, which I feel like we've been in through most of our careers, the funding's a bit more stable. So the way that the funding works is, well, first of all, it's institute dependent. So it's not the same across all institutes, but at least in my institute, every 4 years you go up for something called like a site visit. And it's the equivalent where you have a written component like the R01 mechanism, but then you also have the study section visit on site where you kind of represent your program, your lab, and that. And it's nice because, sometimes in the funding mechanisms, like there's random aspects to it where maybe a reviewer is like, misunderstands something maybe, but all of that can be cleaned up in the in-person session. And then in the final, kind of rounding, if you've done well, your program's not going to be cut just because there's like no money. And so I think the funding's a little more stable in the intramural program. But on the other hand, it's very hard to go and start a company, as Ingrid mentioned, you can so nicely do in the university. So the great parts of it are not as great in the government, but the bad parts are not as bad. It's a little flatter in those highs and lows, I guess I would say.
Kylie, did you have another challenge that you would want to talk about?
I guess I feel the same thing as Judith, like you kind of constantly have challenges that come up and you just have to kind of, just force your way through it and be resourceful and get through it. I think a challenge that I personally have found frustrating throughout my career, like even from the high school days all the way up or even earlier, has been a little bit that, I certainly feel like there's systemic you know, sexism and prejudice in general in the sciences. And, you know, sometimes you can overcome it because, you know, because of common interests, and you both want, or you all, you know, whoever, like the institution and you and everyone involved wants the excellence, right? And so through scientific excellence, I feel like that's the way to overcome it. And sometimes you know, and sometimes it's not so simple to overcome. And again, you just have to focus. For me, I always try to just focus on what I enjoy, which is doing the science. I mean, I really love what I do in terms of the science. And I just remind myself of that in the hard times, is what I would say.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Ingrid, do you have a challenge in mind that you would like to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenges have changed a bit, you know, depending on the stage of my career. I think earlier on, probably very similar to any researcher is, you know, getting scooped is always tough, right? And you know, on a body of research. And I would say there, you know, I would just advise just to persevere, right? And there's always, you know, probably some aspect of the story that you can build on to make it different, and, you know, cite that publication that scooped you as, you know, sort of a basis of, you know, to validate your own findings. And then, you know, it sort of pushes you to look into a new and different aspect, you know, which I think can work out well. You know, later on in my career, I think definitely matching, of course, also being in a sort of biopharma setting, you know, matching what I want to do with the company's goals. I think, you know, there has to be really tight alignment, I think, especially as you advance in your career. And so, you know, I think considering other possibilities, you know, honestly could be a win for everyone, really, because if you move on, that creates a lot of opportunities and growth for people at the previous institution, and then it creates opportunities and growth for you as you move into a new place. So I think, you know, just sort of looking at the big picture in that regard, and you know, that I think that was really helpful.
Great, thank you. All right, we're going to do one more question, and then we'll do audience questions. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and start putting them in that chat box. All right, before we get to audience questions, just one more to wrap up our discussion. With where you are now in your career and everything that you've learned since you have started out, since college, since maybe even high school, what is one thing that you wish you would have known when you had started out, or a piece of advice that you wish you could go back and give yourself? Judith, do you want to start?
Maybe I'll let Kylie talk.
Well, I think the challenge is, right, there's no like one piece of advice. It's not, okay, so I'll just say one thing that I think is useful is to just always remember what you enjoy. I mean, for me, since I was a child, I loved science. And I think if somebody's at this conference, then probably that was true for them too. I think, you know, science is something that I think people are just drawn to it who go into scientific careers. And I think, you know, the one thing that has always kind of held up for me is just remembering that, and remembering, you know, like why I do what I do, and how much I love what I'm doing. And for me, that's really strong in me. And so I think maybe that's the advice for anything in life, just thinking about what's important to you and what you like to do and focusing on that. And and that would be probably the advice. And a piece of advice I got when I was a young grad student was somebody told me to never do what I don't want to do, because if I do what I don't want to do, then that's the path my career would go, right? Because you'd be like doing that and you'd be like known for that. And so I think, it's just the same thing, just following what you enjoy, because then it'll just keep building on what you enjoy. So that would be my one thing. But there's really no one piece of advice you could give somebody, I think.
But actually, I think that is an excellent piece of advice. So I'll just make that my own. Because in reality, science, academic science, I don't know how it is in a company, is quite hard and frustrating. Kylie mentioned sexism. I don't even register it anymore. That has been really a huge issue, especially starting out, and the early stages of the career. It can be really very hard, and managing having kids and having a job and expectations. I think the main thing to think about is, every activity has bad things and good things, and really you have to focus on why you are doing this and what is important for you. I mean, every job has bad things and good things and frustrations, and it's very important not to let fear of failure push you back, right? I mean, I remember when I was thinking about going for an academic position versus some other type of lab manager position, I wondered what will happen if I don't get tenure. And then I realized, well, if I don't get tenure, then I worry what I will do if things don't go the way I would like them to. So I think it's very important to always go with plan A. And plan A is what you really want to do. And if plan A doesn't work, then you can always think of a plan B. But I think being driven by true interest is always the best way to make the right decision, because it's much harder there is a lot less regret if you did what you wanted to do and it didn't work out than if you did something you didn't want to do and it still didn't work out.
Great, thank you. Ingrid, do you have anything to add on?
Well, I would just chime in that I 100% wholeheartedly fully agree that doing what you want to do is really the most important, because the best science is the science that you're the happiest about and that inspires you. And I think the worst science is science that you don't believe in, or that you feel like you're obligated to do, or I don't know. I think that's just really challenging, because science is hard enough in itself, right? I mean, you might as well do something that you're really passionate about and enjoy. I would say the other piece of advice that I wish I would have learned earlier is something that, I've really learned to live by. At first, when I heard it, I was like, what? And the piece of advice is that I needed to learn how to be lazier. Which I thought was really an interesting piece of advice. And I think, what that meant was just to have look at the broader perspective of we're all very, passionate and engaged scientists, right? And we persevere, and that's how we get through the studies. But I think that there's a component of also understanding, and maybe that has to do with am I really, enjoying this, or is this going to jive with my overall goals? Is to understand, does this really matter in the big picture of things? And if it's so hard to achieve, it really comes down to, I guess, knowing when to sort of cut bait and stop working on something that really just isn't getting you, where you want to go. And I think that maybe understanding that sometimes the questions that you're trying to ask, or at least answering, are maybe sort of too far ahead of their time. There isn't the right technology or the right know-how or, to be able to connect the dots. And so don't think of it as like cutting bait, but maybe just setting it aside and giving it a pause and then, coming back to it later. So I think that there's, definitely projects that I worked on in the past that I wish I would have taken that into consideration earlier.